Hello everybody, my name is Kira Vaklovic and I'm the Director of the Centre for Childhood Cultures at Queen Mary University of London. I'm really delighted to welcome you to this first event in our series, Rethinking Childhood Studies Today. I'm just going to say a few words about the Centre and the series before briefly introducing our fantastic speakers today. I also get to do the housekeeping bit, lucky me. So there's probably going to be quite a lot about age in the discussion today, I imagine. And our own centre is just 5 years old, with all the energy, adventure and discovery that so often implies. It's a cross-faculty, interdisciplinary centre, drawing together the work of researchers at all career stages, which shares a focus on children's everyday lives and experiences. The Centre is the home for a range of funded projects. So we have a project funded by the British Academy on storytelling and COVID at the moment, and also an AHRC network on children's dress. The Centre also hosts regular events, including a seminar series, children's literature, children's lives, and a regular PhD discussion group. The series, which today's event will launch, came into being as a result of new colleagues joining different parts of the faculty with different areas of disciplinary expertise, but a shared focus on children and childhood. It's been masterminded by Rachel Bryant-Davis, a classicist who is a lecturer in the Department of Comparative Literature, and Hedy Viterbo, who is a lecturer in law, with precious support also from Honorary Research Fellow Lucy Glasheen. The series is an opportunity for colleagues across Queen Mary and beyond to take stock and to look ahead at what research on and with children and childhood can become in the light of, amongst other things, technological and methodological advances and developments. So what use can we make of AI, for example? And in response to urgent imperatives to decolonise, to globalise and to reframe. Now, in terms of housekeeping, we'd love for members of the audience to get involved in the discussion today. So please do use the chat box to ask any questions or make comments at any point during the discussion. And as many as we can get through will be addressed at the end. If you could please keep yourselves muted during the discussion, that would be most appreciated. So I'm going to introduce now our speakers for today. We have as the main billing Dr. Simon Sleight, who is reader in urban history, historical youth cultures and Australian history. He's co-founding director of the Children's History Society with Mary Claire Martin and deputy director of the Menzies Australia Institute at King's. He's going to be grilled, speaking today with Professor Alastair Owens, a member of the Centre's steering group and a very good friend of the Centre, who's currently head of the School of Geography at Queen Mary. Alastair is a historical geographer and social and economic historian with particular expertise in Victorian London, but wide-ranging interests too, as funded projects that he's currently involved in amply attest, from the urban vicarage project to Stay Home, rethinking the domestic during the COVID-19 pandemic. Alastair works really extensively with organisations beyond academia, and he's a trustee, amongst lots of the other things that he does, of the Ragged School Museum. So then we have a historical geographer, and as we'll see in Alastair's fuller introduction of Simon in a moment, a historian with a decided geographical bent. In other words, we have then an absolutely ideal combination to get the series started. I'm really grateful to you both for being here. And without further ado, Ocelot and I will now hand over to Alastair.
Thank you very much indeed, Kira, for that really lovely introduction. Just to say, Simon, it's not going to be a grilling at all. I'm really looking forward to this conversation. But as Kira was saying, it's great to have Simon with us today, and many of you here I'm sure will be very familiar with Simon's work already, and perhaps you'll know his 2013 book Young People and the Shaping of Public Space in Melbourne 1870 to 1914. But his latest books are, there's a couple of them, History, Memory and Public Life, The Past and the Present. And that was published in 2018. And that's an edited book co-edited with Anna Merker and Adam Sutcliffe. And then more recently, a little bit further back in 2016, he published, in this case edited with Shirlene Robinson, a collection called Children, Childhood and Youth in the British World. Now, the topics covered in those publications, but also in other things that Simon has published, are very wide-ranging. So they include things like urban memory, the morphology of cities, street gangs, urban walking, historical fashion, processions, the representation of working childhoods, expatriate experience, and even the use of historical cartoons. More recently, and I think she's in the audience actually, Simon's been working on a new co-edited project with Christine Alexander, tentatively titled A Cultural History of Youth in the Modern Age. So that's in progress. And then, I guess with particular relevance to today's conversation, in 2014, Simon published a chapter in a book addressing the late Colin Ward, and that was titled The City and the Child, Colin Ward, Urban Becoming and a Shift to Experience, which is going to be one of our themes in our conversation. So Simon's work is rich, it's really suggestive, it's rewarding, as I'm sure those of you who've encountered it would agree. It asks some really big questions, while also working with a quite extraordinary breadth of source material to engage with actually the minutiae of young people's urban experiences. And in his book about Melbourne, for example, which is the bit of his work I know best, we're in the city and we're with its children and youth. We're seeing through their eyes, we're out in the streets, we're grasping the thrills and also negotiating the hazards of the new public spaces of what was actually a very youthful colonial town. We're also guided in Simon's work by a wide range of ideas and theoretical frameworks that take us way beyond Simon's home discipline of history. And again, particularly in the case of the Melbourne book, he works with a range of ideas and thinking about public space by scholars from my own discipline, in geography, for example. So who better, I would say, to open our seminar series and to explore approaches to researching the history of childhood and youth than Simon. And what I'm going to do, Simon, I'm going to start actually, if I may, with a quotation from a recent survey of how historians write about and study childhood. And this survey is by the American social historian Sarah Marza. And I know you've read this paper already. It was published last year in the American Historical Review, for those who are interested, in the October edition, I think it was. And she begins this very interesting essay by saying that the history of children and childhood is, quote, always on the rise and not yet quite risen. So back in the 1980s, we might say that the history of childhood seemed to hold the same kind of promise for contributing towards a revitalized social history as, say, the history of gender or sexuality or race, or maybe other categories too. But somehow, and this is kind of one of the themes of Marza's survey, this has never quite happened in the way that it has for those other categories or themes. And what we'll do is we'll come back to the survey by Marza and we'll get your thoughts on that assessment towards the end of our conversation. But this perhaps brings me to the first of the images on your slide, Simon, if we can switch to that first image. And just to say to everybody, we're going to look at a series of images across our conversation to offer us a few prompts and ways of reflecting on the questions and discussion. So this is what the study of youth cultures used to look like. So, you know, it was big hair, it was assertive, it was 1980s politically radical. So maybe, Simon, you could tell us a bit more about how this becomes for you a kind of starting point for understanding approaches to the history of childhood and youth.
Well, many thanks, Alastair. Hello, everyone, and thanks especially to Lucy, to Kira, and indeed to Alastair for inviting me today to speak with you all. I'm really delighted to help launch what I think is going to be a really engaging and exciting series. And yes, that image, well, here, as I've labelled it, and as Alastair alluded, is what the study of youth cultures used to look like. The interest was in spectacular appearance, in protest, in youth as agents of change, sticking two fingers up to the establishment. It was majority male in interest, and it was very usually concerned with whiteness as a category, although that wasn't a category that was often interrogated. It was also centred on the industrialised West and suffused with a sense of admiration for its subjects. Moreover, I think it was concerned as much, and sometimes more so, with class rather than youth per se, with working class activity especially prized and sometimes projected onto middle class youth. And Dick Hebdige's study, Subculture, The Meaning of Style, published in 1979, is an important torchbearer here, and also reminds us that historians did not have this field to themselves, or even perhaps even occupy the lion's share of it. Those pursuing cultural studies, sociology, anthropology, and yes, geography, were all getting interested in youth. And since that context of the early 1980s, I guess part of the challenge has been to look backwards and forwards from this moment, embracing a wider range of social actors, taking the story beyond the reach of the oral history interview, and continually reworking our understandings through engaging with successive conceptual innovations, including such things as the spatial turn, intersectional approaches, and the history of emotions. Subaltern studies, techniques of reading or brushing against the grain, have also opened up swathes of new source material for scholars to work with. And I'll, maybe come back to you, Alastair, at that point.
Thank you. Well, a good deal of your own work, Simon, and obviously we've mentioned the book, the 2013 book already, has been focused on young people in the late 19th and early 20th century. And I think it's fair to say that a lot of the scholarship emanating from that particular period, or focus, I should say, on that particular period, has been concerned with the negative effects of the city on the child, and your work is very much urban focused. So it's been about the study of destitute children, of themes of victimhood, of powerlessness, of children often within institutions, as children as objects of welfare and philanthropy. So that's been a major focus of lots of the historiography, and indeed continues to be an important area in which people are working. But just to shift on to your next slide, I mean, I think one of the things that scholarship has done is to reinforce a particular 19th century discourse, which is kind of well illustrated in this rather nice painting here, which sees the child as being kind of imperiled by the city. So it's a discourse actually that was often very much reinforced by some of those institutions I just mentioned. So, you know, the imperiled child was there for rescuing by some of these welfare organisations and charities in the late 19th century in particular. So would you agree with that, I guess, is my question. And what kind of contribution has this sort of work made? And what are its limitations for understanding young people's history in the context of the urban?
Thanks, Alastair. Well, I would largely agree with that characterisation. Coming back to this painting, here we have an image of the child as imperilled, pallid. And urban youth were very often cast in this way in cities around the world. They were seen to be at odds with the forces of rapid industrialisation and urbanisation. This image is really depicting a kind of urban everywhere that is in fact London. And this fallen child is being scooped up from the wet pavement by this woman dressed in widow's weeds. She's in mourning, and she may also be in mourning again soon for this child. Of course, there's a sort of propagandistic aspect to a painting such as this. It urges outside intervention, or what used to be called child rescue. And the fact that this was an international discourse is, I think, underscored by the fact that this was a painting that came to Melbourne for a large exhibition in the early 1890s, and currently resides in regional Victoria, in Bendigo, in the same sorts of area that children from the city were sent to by child rescue organisations in the 19th century in an effort to get them out of the big metropolis. And I guess my earlier work challenges the logic of this painting, the inherent logic of this painting, and it builds on what are important studies, I want to stress, of children located in institutions, so schools, orphanages, factories, and so on. Such places are indeed significant sites of youthful experience and encounter, and they've proved attractive to historians and other scholars because they often yield discrete bodies of archival evidence amenable to analysis. But I think, and as I argued in that work, such studies, which often start with the institution and work towards the child rather than the other way around, they also miss a good deal. And this is because in the period addressed by that book, starting in the 1870s, children were often not stuck indoors in institutional settings. They were outside doing things. Some were on the streets, like this child pictured here. And scholars used to look to the onset of compulsory education in the early 1870s as a sharp turning point. But evidence, in fact, reveals that in Australia, as well as in Britain and in America and elsewhere, the lack of enforcement of compulsory schooling meant that until at least the early 1900s, the school had a less firm grip on youth of the period than has been assumed. So through working on my Melbourne book, I conjured this idea of what I called the youthscape, which was a layer of hitherto little studied city life. It was an underlying, overlapping and competing city space produced by young people under the noses of adults. This was a space that was produced in the terms of Henri Lefebvre and others, and it was a space that was always ephemeral, but it's one that persisted in altered forms, as this image of youth attests. This this place under the clocks at Flinders Street Station is a classic meeting spot for teens in Melbourne, and indeed it has been so since the turn of the 19th century. It was a site where courtship activities would often begin, for instance, and it suggests a very different reading to Kennington's painting. Here we have another young person lying in an urban space, but she's not vulnerable in this particular case, at least not in the same way that the Kennington child is.
So thank you for that. Yes, I think your work on Melbourne does do something really quite different, doesn't it, to a lot of that other scholarship, and that as a geographer is partly what excites me about it. So you're certainly not writing a history of confined and oppressed childhoods there. It's less a history of kind of disciplinary institutions, and it's actually more one of a certain kind of freedom, I guess. So it's that focus on the public lives of children and on those public spaces where children were mobile and active and very much engaged, as you were just saying now, on the production of urban space, again, to draw upon Lefebvre. So that's what you've developed a little bit in your book, and is one of the kind of richest and most interesting things for me about your work. So children in that book are often portrayed as, quite confident and daring. Some of them are quite resourceful, even quite successful actually at making their lives in the city. But that's not to say that you don't also consider more marginal figures, nor that those more marginal figures have not been an important focus in other studies of children and youth. And I think here one of the challenges, a challenge you've no doubt grappled with a lot, must be how the experiences of those children who are marginal or who are at least deemed to be marginal. And I suppose in some senses, people will be familiar with the idea that all children are seen to be sort of marginal. They are people in the process of becoming. They're not yet adults. They're not yet fully being. So in that sense, they're often cast as marginal. So how do you connect the experience, and that's a word we're going to come back to in some depth later on, the experience of those young people, those young marginalised people, with the kind of larger historical narratives or kind of bigger stories that we want to tell? So have you done that in your own work? And then maybe, have you been inspired by other scholarship that's done that rather well, or done that in a different way?
Sure, thank you. Let me come to marginalisation after I've discussed a little bit more about mobility, because the two things are in fact in some ways linked. So if I just stay within the scope of my research on Melbourne initially in answering this question, one of the things I got interested in conducting that research is what I called urban range, namely how far young people of different ages, class positions, ethnicities and genders could travel across the city. And there's much investigation, as we know, about this in contemporary times. Books such as Last Child in the Woods and One False Move come to mind, but there was little historical research that took us beyond, as I said before, the reach of the oral history interview. And I was pleased to find such resources as the Melbourne Parks and Gardens Committee sort of minutes and records, not on first sight what you thought might have a lot of information about childhood and youth, but in fact they did. And then that led me to think about autobiographies and diaries and so on. And it became clear quickly that young people enjoyed very different mobilities depending on their status in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. So to give you an example of this, and there's the book on Melbourne just there. Let me take a map from that book, which I hope you can see. Perhaps you can nod if so, Alastair. Yeah, thank you. I thought I might just sort of recount the journey of one individual before we turn to the more circumscribed journeys of perhaps more marginalised figures. So there was a figure I came across called E. Morris Miller. And he was 7 at the time that he undertook this particular journey, which I'm going to attempt to draw for you on the slide here. So he was on a day out with his parents to St Kilda, and he eluded their supervision. He eluded their control. And so he walked up the beach, then he walked up this street here, which is Fitzroy Street, and arrived at the train station. Being quite enterprising, he boarded the train back into central Melbourne. He then got off the train at Flinders Street Station, which was the site of the photograph we saw earlier with the children and teenagers lounging. He then got on a tram and went round the corner to Spencer Street Station, at which point he hopped off the tram and got on another train, and then he went off to Newmarket, which is somewhere up here, I think. Yes, that's right. Then got off that train, and he walked home to Shield Street, where he lived. And as I said, he was 7 at the time. This was a remarkable journey, and that's why it was recorded in the autobiography. But the Parks and Gardens Committee minutes revealed that other urban children were making journeys that were not much less spectacular, from their crowded working class homes to parks and so on, where they were intercepted by the authorities, and that's how we know about them. But this wasn't the case for the next group of children who I want to discuss. I'll just try and get rid of the pen function. There we go. And these were the Chinese children of Melbourne's Chinatown. For those that don't know, Melbourne has one of the longest lasting Chinatowns in the same location in any city in the world. And here we have a number of children pictured in a doorway in Chinatown in Melbourne in around 1900. And I want to find out more about the lives of these children, but it's actually really rather difficult. I read into their lives through the work of scholars such as Sophie Couchman and others, and I was able to find out about children engaging with actors in and around this area. This was the theatre district of Melbourne too, and I was also able to speculate on their lives through their absence in other forms of record. So, for example, those fabled committee minutes, which I keep going on about, they didn't have any Chinese names in them, which meant that the children intercepted in the parks, none of them over a very long period had Chinese names, which I thought was interesting in itself. And I wondered if that was because they enjoyed a more circumscribed form of urban range. And here, what I've come to understand subsequently as my status as in part a trans-urban historian, following the term coined by Richard Roger. This is an approach which seeks to compare cities and precincts of cities with one another and to elude the shaping force of the national frame. This led me to look elsewhere for inspiration, to the fantastic work of Wendy Rouse-Duray, for example, on San Francisco, and a book that we see here. And it's also encouraged me to go back to the sources, to read once more against, and indeed across the grain. And such sources for urban childhood are really very rich and varied. You can see some examples on screen here, and youthful activity crops up in them in all sorts of interesting and surprising places. Now, in your question, Alastair, you mentioned being and becoming as well. And so perhaps now it's time for me to sort of cast some light on this as a key dialectic for scholars of youth, that tension between, do we understand youth as becoming adults or as being in the moment? Should we understand these two American newsboys, which were used in the publicity for this event, as journeying towards adulthood, or as standing in the street at this time being young? Well, I would argue that we need to keep an eye on the former, namely their becoming status, but also very much to study youth in their own terms. And a really excellent recent example of where a scholar has done just this is in this book, Vince D. Girolamo's Crying the News. And I really can't recommend this book highly enough. I don't know if you can see me on the screen at the moment, but it's an absolute sort of doorstopper. It's sort of, almost 700 pages. And it's a really sort of magisterial study of the lives and social meanings of newsboys and indeed newsgirls across an expansive chronological and geographical terrain. As Vince writes, and I quote, "The history of newsboys is the history of the working class writ small." And this engagement with class is just one of the contributions of this book to macro scale narratives. So by following the newsboys and understanding them as agents of their own lives, we learn about shifting conceptions of childhood, about modes of representation, about disability status. We learn about histories of education and philanthropy. We learn about the history of sound through learning about newsboys' cries. We learn about histories of material culture. What happened to newspapers? Some children wore them to keep warm, or put them in their shoes, or made hats out of them, slept on them, and so on. We learn about histories of war. And in short, we learn about social change in America through the lives of these young people. So I think this is a really terrific example of understanding children as being, but with an eye to their becoming as well, and also with an eye to the larger narratives which they cast light on.
Thank you, and I think actually Vince is maybe in the audience, so we can debate this further.
Excellent.
In due course. So, I mean, that approach, it sounds wonderful, and I look forward to reading this book too. But also what you were saying a few moments ago about your work in Melbourne, and taking us on that journey with that 7-year-old and tracing that child through the city. And a lot of your work and other scholarship has been very much focused on quite specific spaces, and particularly in that urban context. Streets we've been talking about, railway stations, neighbourhoods, parks, markets, whatever it might be, those different spaces that make up a city. And in many ways, this follows a trend in much of the research on childhood that I can think of that is very much focused on local or micro scales. And I suppose the same would be true of what we were mentioning a little bit earlier, those histories of institutional childhoods where you're focused on children's homes, training centres, poor law institutions, schools, those sorts of things. So we're often focused on very specific and often quite localised spaces when that research is being done. Now, your earlier work on Melbourne was certainly very attentive to the kind of colonial context to that city, though arguably that book is more kind of inward looking than it is outward looking in terms of its kind of broader history, contribution to the history of Melbourne. But your more recent edited collection that I mentioned at the start, and I'm thinking in particular the book with Shirlene Robinson, which is titled Children, Childhood and Youth in the British World. That book adjusts the scale, doesn't it? So you think much more explicitly, or your contributors think much more explicitly about the colonial frame. And in that sense, as this slide ably demonstrates, that work parallels other significant scholarship, and quite a wide range of it, by a range of other people that's tried to trace imperial childhoods, if we're thinking particularly about the 19th and early 20th century, or maybe later kind of global youths. So would you agree that this feels like an important new direction in the study of children, childhood and youth? And do you think we have the right tools for connecting those often very empirically localized studies that we've just been talking about of children's experiences with those wider geographical contexts that are interrogated in the publications that we see on the screen there?
Many thanks. Well, yes, it's true to say that new life, indeed young life, has been breathed into imperial history, geography and literary scholarship in recent years. And alongside the collection that you mentioned, there are many other studies that have emerged in parallel and that indeed continue to be written. Just two of those are on the screen here. It's a new direction in terms of scholarship, but as is so often the case, it's not so much in terms of the sources, the primary sources, because they were always there, but they awaited modes of understanding and indeed the value and interest in them in the first place by scholars. Youth, I think, was so often in the vanguard of imperialism, and the best works seek to look from multiple vantage points in order to try and comprehend that. And also, very importantly, they seek to understand Indigenous perspectives, what the famous Australian historian Henry Reynolds called the other side of the frontier. They seek to look both directions across that frontier. And many of the audience zooming in today will perhaps have heard of the Historians Collaborate initiative. If you haven't, do look it up through Twitter. And the arena of imperial scholarship and indeed global studies scholarship, which we'll come to in a minute, seems to offer a particularly productive place for historians to collaborate. And I'm going to argue that I think that's probably the best way for such types of work to be written. Because the era of the kind of epic, sweeping archival trip, hopping in and out of multiple countries, is certainly paused at the moment. And indeed, it may never quite return in the same way, perhaps rightly so, if like me, you worry about the environmental impacts of sort of fly in, fly out, short visits. So I guess getting together rather in new ways to pool our expertise is a particularly shrewd move to make. And I would probably still be writing that book with Shirlene if we hadn't had an array of expert contributors to cast light on such topics as mothercraft, Indian childhood, children's literature, frontier sexualities and memorialization. And it's pleasing to see scholars less and less worried about sticking only to sole-authored monographs as the kind of without which nothing of scholarship. But that said, I have long pondered what is lost as well as what is gained by adjusting the scale. Something that's come into even sharper focus through working on a different book with a different stable of experts alongside my co-editor, Christine Alexander. Here, rather worryingly, is the page for the book, which isn't quite yet finished and doesn't yet have a book cover, but is already being marketed on the Bloomsbury website. And as a sneak preview of some of the things that we're going to be saying in that book's introduction, we work through often well-founded critiques of global history, but it addresses circuits without subjects or flows without feelings, as we put it. And we think through what has been called global micro-history and how that might be able to help us in understanding the histories of childhood and youth in diverse places. And we also argue, following the work of others, that being global doesn't have to mean writing about everywhere. To adjust the lens once more, many historians have written successful global histories of single cities like London, or of single commodities like tea or cotton. And I guess to come back to your question directly, we may not yet have all of the tools that we need to bridge the micro and the macro, but that's okay. Let's work on creating those tools and looking to other disciplines to see what they might have to offer too.
Thank you. It certainly feels something familiar that we've been grappling with in geography for a number of years, thinking about the global and the local together and how you can do that. But to move on to something a little bit different, though they're still related. One thing that scholars of childhood often seem to be, or in fact constantly seem to be in search of, is children and young people's agency. And there is a sense, I guess, we've touched upon this a bit already, that for young people, agency is actually hard to find. Sometimes it's masked by adults, and therefore, for historians, the job is to try and recover that agency in some way. And there are different ways of doing that. You know, from time to time, people claim they will have found a new source that gives you a much more direct insight into children's words, their thoughts and their actions, and whatever we take agency to mean. Other times, and again, we've spoken briefly about this already, it's about how we may, with a bit of patience, with some care and often quite a bit of creativity, we can reread other kinds of historical sources with different eyes, if you like. We can look at institutional records, for example, and we can find within them, or we can bring to the fore, some form of children's agency. But equally, and many people here will be familiar with these debates, in recent years, some historical scholars, and indeed people working across other disciplines too, have mounted a bit of a critique of that idea of agency. So recognising that to look for and expect evidence of agency, or to use a different word, resilience, among those who were marginalised or oppressed, can be actually quite problematic, and maybe it doesn't appreciate the kind of complex ways in which power can work. So where do you stand on that particular debate? How does that figure in your work, and why do you take a particular position on it? I mean, what's wrong with that search for agency, which probably is still the central intellectual project for quite a lot of people researching childhood?
Indeed so. I mean, I've just in hearing what you've said, I've noted down the word resilience, as I haven't heard anyone define agency in quite that way before. So that's really interesting too. But I guess let's have a think about the case against agency. And here I'm drawing on the work of Mona Gleeson in particular, some really important work and a recent keynote talk by Mona, and also by others, including Karen Valgada and Stephanie Olson. Several of these points, as you read through them on the screen, take us back to that image of punks with which I began. And certainly in my view, several of these contentions hold lots of water. Now, from my own perspective, and as I've said, in the lively debate a number of us had on this topic, and which you can catch up on if you missed it through the link at the bottom of the slide. In my own work, agency was less about rebellion or as an end in itself, and something more akin to self-assertion, to modes of self-presentation for instance, through being photographed, to movement and mobility, to assent, in parallel here with the work of Susan Miller, and sometimes to assent in ways that we might not always find comfortable from contemporary perspectives. It was also akin more to decision-making and to youthful source production. That said, it's not a term I used or use much at all, actually, partly as I've long preferred that other key word from today, experience, as a category of analysis. Although I must confess, I hadn't really fully thought through agency and experience as much as I might have done until prompted by the current debate. So I'm really grateful for this lively engagement that is going on at the moment. That said, I hope it's a sort of discussion that before too long we can move beyond, because the histories of children and childhood very much await being written. So I would like to see some of the energy from that discussion channeled into that before too long. But I do think this is a really kind of exciting debate. But as I've said, that word experience has always been more easily amenable for me to the sorts of analysis that I've wanted to write.
Thank you. Well, let's turn to that, because as you said, we've called this event Understanding Experience, Approaches to the History of Childhood and Youth. And experience is a word we've thrown around a little bit already in our conversation. But what is, talk me through some of this. I'm less familiar with some of these debates. What is this kind of turn to experience? What do we mean by it? How might it help us overcome some of the things that you've got on the screen here, which are problematic about this idea of agency, and maybe what else might it offer people working in childhood studies and childhood history?
Sure, Alastair, thank you. Yeah, it's something old, it's something new, it's something borrowed, and it's not quite something blue, but it might be when we turn to some of the colours I've used for the slides. So yeah, well, what is experience? For me, it's the feel and fabric of everyday life. And geographer Tim Creswell writes in similar terms. And I guess it might be worth working through some definitions at this point. And as we'll see, some of these take us backwards in time as well as forwards, and offer some potentially productive twists for scholars of children and youth. So here's the start on screen of Norman Fisher's recent thoughts on experience, and I like lots that is set out here, and invite you to take a look. Some of what's here presupposes the emotional turn within scholarship, and I also like the grounded nature, the spatial basis, if you will, of what's being proposed. There's no need to be agentic, to pick up on the agency debate, to have experiences such as these, though one might experience such experiences through social action. Here's a longer definition from that very handy series of writings on keywords. It's long, so again, I've added some takeaways in orange, and this might be something that the audience wants to comb through in more detail via the later recording. So as well as reminding us about discursive contexts in this extract and the importance of remembering structures of power, I was struck, particularly on the left-hand column, by how many or how much of the entry sort of utilizes examples pertaining to youth. So you'll see that on the left-hand side. And I realise that you'll still probably be reading this, and at the risk of annoying you all by dragging you away from Joan Scott, some of this got me thinking about formative experiences as a sort of subcategory within experience. Now, these aren't the only experiences, I should stress, that might be of interest to us, but they might have a particular power for historians of children and youth. Let's see, and perhaps also let's not forget that there's a little bit of a back to the future feel about this recent interest in experience, about which I should say I'm very pleased, because for scholars such as Roger Hart and Colin Ward, who we mentioned earlier on, and indeed the late Chinese-American geographer Yi Fu Tuan, well, they've been talking about experience since the 1970s. And for them, it was a key conduit for historical understanding, including of youth. And I also wonder what Mark Bloch, Fernand Braudel, and other scholars of the early 20th century would have made of this too, or indeed some of the social historians of the 1960s. But I think that by returning to experience now, what we might be able to do, as Fisher propounds, and as is also picked up in a recent book by Rob Boddice and Mark Smith, is to build the sensory, the embodied, and the emotional into histories of experience in new ways. As well, I would strongly advance, as to keep the focus on the spatial dimensions of life. Space, time, and the body's dispositions, these then might turn out to be the key elements in any new histories of experience, and I guess we shall see.
Thank you. I mean, it does certainly sound promising, and that sort of revisiting of older ideas is always an attractive thing in my view, and thinking through them again in the context of subsequent scholarly developments. One thing that you're, I guess, hinting at here, we've got geographers, we've got other people on the screen. A lot of the work that happens in childhood studies seems to be open to interdisciplinary perspectives and approaches. And that's something certainly we're trying to do at Queen Mary. So that's the whole point really of the Centre for Childhood Cultures, that we're, as Kira was saying at the start, we're trying to bring people from across the humanities, but also the social sciences and even into, you know, the natural sciences and so on, into a space where we can share ideas, we can discuss, and we can develop projects together. So it feels to me like studies of the history of childhood, or childhood studies more generally, is quite an open space. I mean, a bit like geography where I'm located. I mean, you may not agree with that. I mean, is it fair to characterize the field as such, particularly the history of childhood and youth, as it's interdisciplinary? And if it is, and maybe you've hinted at this a bit already, what are the most interesting or important interdisciplinary conversations that are happening in this space at this moment?
Sure, I think it is fair, and let me tell you why. Here's a nice definition of what we're talking about here. Well, I think we can certainly say that some of the best work within the field of childhood studies is interdisciplinary by its very nature. And this is because scholars of young people have long needed to be especially innovative, I think, and dare I say, more so than scholars in certain other fields, sometimes fields, dare I say, with trenches in seeking to understand youth. So particularly influential have been sociologists, and one might think here of work from the 1990s showing how childhood is socially constructed as a category rather than a biological given. We could think of geographers in insisting on how childhood is lived in space as well as through time. And indeed scholars of intersectionality from all manner of fields, including feminism and critical race theory. Personally, I also really enjoy reading philosophical works which embrace childhood, and probably my favourite all-time book on the history of childhood is Walter Benjamin's Berlin Childhood around 1900, which is a kind of very philosophical take on what it was like to be a child, written from a sort of more distant and indeed a perspective of exile. What's the most important now in terms of debates? Well, I was having to think about this, and I suppose there is really interesting debate among scholars of medicine and science about brain function and bodily development, and thoughts on the purported moodiness or truculence of the teenage years. Is that something that's biologically predetermined? I'm always sort of anxious when anyone starts to suggest things like that, but it is nonetheless an interesting debate. There's also debate about youth's interface with technology, and that debate is in some ways a reprise of earlier debates about children's use of let's say, sort of penny dreadful comics, or video nasties, as they were called in the 1980s, and so on. So there's interesting kind of discussion about technology and youth that I think is going on at the moment. And also, surely I would say that debates between scholars of youth and public policy makers are also influential at present. And I'm thinking here of ongoing discussions about the Child-Friendly Cities initiative that grew out of Italy, for instance, but also moving beyond that into other areas of kind of public policy making. So youth is featuring in different places. Scholarship on childhood and youth is often inherently interdisciplinary, because we search in other fields than our own for models and concepts which we can test and apply within our kind of home disciplines. That's a strength, I think, that scholars of childhood and children and youth can offer to scholars that don't work on those young subjects. And it's something I think we could make more of a virtue of selling as a kind of key contribution of our scholarship.
Well, that's a rather neat link, I think, to what's going to be my final question, really, which is around that kind of contribution that childhood studies and particularly the study of the history of childhood and youth can make. And I'm going to go back to that paper that I mentioned at the start. And for those who arrived a little bit late, there we go. It's a paper by Sarah Maza, published in the American Historical Review back in October last year, 2020. And Kira has posted in the chat, I think, a link to that paper or the reference if you want to go and have a read of it. And that paper it's a kind of provocation, really, on historians, and these are her words, and the problem of childhood, as you can see there. And at one level, to me, it actually seemed to be a really helpful critical synthesis of the field and its development. But also, if you read it, it's not necessarily an essay that's terribly invigorating for the field, and her critique sometimes can be quite harsh, quite damning. But one intriguing argument is her suggestion that the most successful scholarship in the field of history of childhood, history of youth, the most successful scholarship in that field is where children become a conceptual entry point for investigating larger histories or larger historical processes. So to quote from the conclusion of the paper, writing history through children rather than of them. So what's your take on this paper, Simon? I mean, do you see things differently? What would you want to critique of her own critique of the discipline? And I guess to finish on the big open question, you know, where do you see things headed in the future?
Let me make a note of that final question. I shall ponder that as well. Where headed in the future? Well, to me, this paper, I mean, I was having a chat with Christine Alexandra about it yesterday, and I was saying that it's sort of like the literature review that went rogue. You can sort of see how it started, and you can't quite work out where it ended up and why. For me, it's sort of the proverbial curate's egg, good in parts, but I would argue that the sour parts are certainly more dominant than the sweet, and it's those that sort of give an odd flavour to the mouth when you repeatedly visit this piece. It's not written by someone who is an expert in the field at the outset, although there's nothing necessarily wrong in sort of hopping across fields to offer reviews. But if you're going to do that, you need to read more widely than has been the case with this particular paper. So let's have a think about what some of the contentions are within it. Well, among them are that childhood is a vanishing act, that the history of children and childhood is always on the rise and not yet quite risen, as the first line there states, that we should seek to write histories of adults through children rather than of children, that children are not comparable with other social groups, that existing histories of youth have not significantly recast understandings of what the author calls normal history, that they are overtly descriptive rather than analytical, and most oddly of all for me, that youthful autonomy, such as seen through activism, is a marker of adult rather than childlike status, with children elsewhere cast, in the author's words, as socially helpless. So here's what I think of much of this. And let's start with that idea of the vanishing act. Well, if childhood is a vanishing act, one might wonder, isn't all human life a vanishing act in some form or another? Isn't childhood instead better understood as a period in which all other social demarcations come to be formed and experienced? And sadly, we must remember that all too many children, especially historically, but also today, never reach full adulthood. Should we write them out of history as somehow failing an historian's test? There's also other criticisms, and I invite everyone to read the lively responses to this piece by scholars such as Bengt Sandin and Ashita Pand. And, you know, for example, Sandin points to the lack of reading conducted by the author on anything written really outside North America, with a few exceptions to that, because a lot of what is being called for in this paper, i.e. telling the history of wider social formations and forces through children and childhood, is actually already being done. I held up a copy of a book doing just that earlier, crying the news. That's not in the in the bibliography. Nothing really from Scandinavia is in there. Nothing from Australia. So it's sort of an odd focus to talk about the whole history of childhood using only a selection of material, and also missing out material that does in fact do lots of the things that the author is calling for. I think Ashita's contribution is also very important, not least for sort of building on that overtly North American Western perspective within this piece, by calling attention to the non-West, if you will, for want of a better term, and how power structures, for instance, operating through systems of imperialism, permanently cast people, including adults, from colonial countries as youthful or childlike, and never able to attain the status of adulthood. All of that is sort of missed out in the original contribution here too. So for me, as I kind of, with the assistance of my youthful graffiti artist here, as I've sort of altered this, because I think in fact there are many more possibilities from the history of childhood than there are problems. And if historians of children, childhood and youth speak about the challenges they face, that's terrific. It's great to be aware of one's own subjectivities and the conceptual difficulties that we face. And in fact, I think that in thinking through some of these issues in response to Marza's paper, it sort of shows how the scholarship that so many of us contribute to can actually be portable in terms of its methodological and conceptual utility for other fields. The techniques we use to read sources, the awareness of age as a category of historical analysis, still so often missed by scholars who don't work on histories of childhood and youth. I mean, and I could go on, and I'm sure those in the audience will have quite a lot to say about this piece too, potentially, because I know it's been very widely read. And I guess I just to finish on it, I would say it is a bit of a shame that this piece will stand in the American Historical Review for, I mean, I doubt they'll revisit this discussion for a decade or more now. And for me, it's a rather short-sighted piece. Yes, it does offer some useful things, and perhaps I've been unfair in spending time talking about the things that I disagree about it with, but I invite everyone to take a look and to read the responses and see what they think. Feel free to disagree with me if you want to, but I think that our field offers far more possibilities than problems. So I would stick with the spray can alteration here.
Thank you. Well, I think over the past 3/4 of an hour, nearly an hour actually, you've painted a rather different but equally stimulating picture of what's been going on in the field, referring to your own work, but also generously to that of lots of other scholars. I don't know whether you wanted to have a go at that very final question as to where things might be headed in the future.
Sure. Sorry. Yes.
It's a bit of a wide open one, but
yes. Sorry, I'm still so annoyed by this paper. I forgot to come back to that. Where is the field headed? Well, historians are always better at looking backwards rather than forwards. I think we've got some way to go with the global history approach. There's a lot of work that needs to be done outside the West, and that doesn't have to be by scholars from outside the West. It could be from scholars working within it, looking outwards. I think that the history of emotions has yielded all sorts of exciting new insights and still has some way to run. What will be the next sort of major paradigm beyond that? I'm not sure. Surely, though, there'll be more to say about environmental history and young people. I know, for example, people are gathering material from the climate strikes and so on, and looking to work through that. Will the generation that is currently regarded as youthful be cast somehow as the COVID generation? Will that yield more interest in histories of kind of illness and potentially more interest in histories of being sort of restricted in some way? But I think this is a field which is always on the rise and not yet quite risen, as the first line of this paper says, and that's terrific. I don't want to be working in a field that regards itself as having arrived. I want to be helping push the wheel forwards rather than sort of contentedly sat around the campfire congratulating ourselves on how well we've done. I think it's great that we're on the rise. It's certainly not on the decline. I think we can see that through the energy at sort of graduate level. There are a lot of terrific PhDs being produced. I'm sure some by many of our audience members. I've had the pleasure of examining a few of these in recent years. There's a great energy among young scholars in writing about the histories of childhood and youth. So I think that's something to be celebrated. There's also, of course, societies that are proliferating, examining the histories of childhood and youth. There are also activities such as the Colonial Countryside project, which garnered such strong attention in recent months, which are seeking to kind of work with young people. I think that's another huge growth area, to understand children's own histories. So I think the field is in rude health, actually, rather than being akin to that pallid child with which we began.
Great. Well, that's a wonderful thought to end on. I think rude health of the discipline. So now's an opportunity to, well, first of all, just to thank Simon for that. So rich and stimulating, and lots of ideas for all of us. But now's an opportunity for others to pose questions for Simon. And we thought we'd just use the chat for people to pose their questions, and then I can relay those to Simon. There have actually, Simon, been lots of sort of very appreciative comments already in the chat, and various ideas and suggestions. So I'm going to sort of have a quick scan through and pick out things which are more obviously questions, but if people have got particular things they want to ask, if they could think of those and add those to the chat, we'll pick them up in a moment. But I'm just going to start with one question which came from Laura Sefton. When we were talking a little while ago about the book that really inspired you, that you showed us, which is this: doesn't the idea of children in the process of becoming imply that adulthood is a static state in which human beings stop becoming.
Yeah.
So historians of selfhood would say that adults too are always in that process as well, inflected and shaped by their historical context.
Absolutely, I would 100% agree with that. The idea that you only become when you're not an adult is odd. I mean, there's all sorts of fantastic work from other fields on, you know, difficult and challenging histories, but the process of, say, becoming a terrorist as an adult, that is a process of becoming, and perhaps unbecoming as well, in terms of de-radicalization. So yes, becoming never finishes, but we mustn't concentrate too much on that, in my view. The 19th century sort of city fathers, if you will, were obsessed with what children would become and how this might or might not lead to national reinvigoration or imperial decline or whatever it might be. But that doesn't also mean that as scholars, we should be only interested in kind of children's futures. Childhood is a status and an experience in itself that is very worthy of our scholarly attention, and we shouldn't only be interested in what people become later. So I would very much agree with that comment, that the process of becoming never stops, but so too the process of being is significant. That process, I suppose, does stop, as does becoming with death, but there's an awful lot of life to study before that moment.
Thank you. There's a very interesting comment here from Marsheed Mayer, who, when we were talking about agency, reflected that the least critical aspect of the work that agency does is how it fails to take conformity into account as agential as well. So that's a nice thought there. Yes,
and I think the Susan Miller reading on agency as assent, or assent as agency rather, is a key thing to have a look at in regards to that. And that's something that I know Christine's going to be picking up on in the introduction to our book as well.
Okay, picking up on another comment, this is from Natasha Prager, and in her work, she's a first-year PhD student, so new to things still. She's been very struck by the focus on chronological age in existing studies of age. So her question is, where does childhood and youth, in terms of the life course, end?
Okay, yes, that is a classic question and a very good one. And I think where does could you just say how it was framed exactly?
Sorry, I actually read it slightly incorrectly as well. So where does childhood and youth end, in brackets, in terms of the life course?
Where does childhood and youth end? Well, for some it doesn't end, and there are concepts of rejuvenation, which is a very interesting area of study. People trying to recapture childhood and youth through surgical interventions and special pills that one might take, or spa retreats that one might go on, things like that. But it's flexible. I know this sounds like a bit of a on the fence answer. It's historically specific as to when those kind of chronological markers fall. Chronologically specific is also specific in terms of the setting, specific in terms of the gender of the person. Look at G. Stanley Hall's fabled book Adolescence, which argues that there's a different period of adolescence for boys and girls. It's also raced. It's probably sort of marked with relevance to disability status as well, in possibly nefarious ways. So often scholars look at the sort of school age years, but interestingly, each year when I teach a course on young lives, I ask my undergraduate students, who are normally around, they're in the third year, around the age of 21, when I ask them this, I ask them to put their hand up if they consider themselves an adult. And normally out of 20, only 2 or 3 do. And this is because they feel that they're within the, albeit higher education system. They're often living at home. They're financially dependent on their parents, and various other reasons. So there may be a period of what scholars have called waithood, which is an extended period while one waits to stop being considered young or considering oneself young, and to be able to do things like get into the job market, possibly get onto the housing ladder, and so on. So unfortunately, my answer is a very convoluted one, in that there isn't a finite answer to it.
Thanks, Simon. I think I've covered most of the things in the chat. I wondered whether we've got another one here from Laura. Others happy to bring you in, and Lucy, are we able to unmute if people put their hands up and they could ask their questions verbally too? We can do that. Great. So that's another way of doing it. If you prefer to ask your question, if you raise your hand at the bottom of your screen, you'll see there's a little icon for reactions. If you click on that, it gives you an option to raise hand, and if you do that, then I will have a look at the participants list and I should spot you. But Laura's got one more sort of question comment. You've spoken so wonderfully about how we research children's experience. Just wondered what your thoughts are on how we write it.
Oh, great question. Well, I'm still figuring that out, I suppose. So one of the things that the Marza article accuses scholars of childhood of doing is of merely writing compendiums of kind of experience. Well, this person did that, and then this other person did this, and not thinking analytically enough. Now, I don't think that's a fair charge, but I think it is something that we need to keep an eye on when we're writing. We need to think about how experience can illuminate broader historical changes and continuities. The best historians of childhood and youth very much do this. There is also a value, though, in writing about experiences for their own sake. These are often historical subjects who have nowhere before appeared on the pages or in the pages of historical works. Their activities, their experiences deserve a historical outing, if you will. Yes, analysis is really important nonetheless, but I think sometimes the mistake can be that people decide on the macro level analytical move they wish to make and then seek out lots of different voices that seem to argue for that, rather than work out from the voices and experiences to think about what potentially new and hitherto hidden narratives might be able to be further explored. A really good example of where this is done brilliantly is in a prize-winning article called "The Cowboy Suit Tragedy" by Barbara Young-Welke, who's a legal historian, and I very much invite people to see just how much you can get out of studying a historical moment or moments, in this case, the conflagration of a children's toy kind of outfit, a cowboy outfit, in understanding all sorts of things to do with consumerism, law, and beyond. So the way to write experience is probably to read about how other people have written about experience and to think about it, is my answer. Thank you.
Vincent de Girolamo, whose book you mentioned earlier on and plugged, which does sound like a fantastic read, was making the observation that COVID, just going back to actually your previous response to the previous question, COVID seems to be increasing that kind of weighted for the current generation of youth. And I think also, Lucy makes a linked comment. We're seeing a lot of popular debate at the moment about those markers being deferred. The fact that there's lots of insecurity for people around employment, around getting on a housing ladder or whatever it might be, and getting secure shelter.
Yes, absolutely. It is a cause of great anxiety and depression indeed, this really extended period of wait and worry. It makes one also think about other periods in the past, such as the First and Second World War, where people at the time did not know when these events were coming to an end. We don't know at the moment when the COVID crisis is coming to an end, and that, I think, helps us rethink the daily lives of people living in, say, the First and Second World War, as I've said, because it gives us increased empathy for what that might have been like. And empathy is, I think, one of the key tools that historians of children and childhood can offer to other scholars in other fields.
Thank you. I think I have a hand up, but I can't quite tell who's got their hand up. Is there a... Mashid, would you like to ask your question?
Yes, thank you so much. I wanted to kind of get back to the question of how to write children's experiences. And one of the things that I have been doing in all the pending publications that I have, so no one has read them yet, is to look at children without really being curious about what they became when they grew older.
Good, yeah.
And, you know, to actively actually stop searching for the adult.
Yeah.
And I'm still struggling with the limitations of, you know, how far can I actually go with this, of how many of us have access to sources produced by children who did not end up having stellar adulthoods, so that we don't feel tempted to do so. But I thought of just putting that idea here as some kind of a comment / question. What do you think about this, Simon, of stopping to think about children's future and looking at their presence, because then that is where all the experience is taking place. That is where they are living fully without really thinking about whether they are going to become famous or not. Probably they hope so, but this is not really what they are planning and working towards. So.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you. That's a terrific question. You're absolutely right. I think progressive and developmentalist narratives have haunted 20th century writing in many ways, not just about children and childhood, but about countries. We still use these terms, developed and undeveloped, for nations which come from age-based categories, and obviously I think immediately need to be tossed out. And you're right, yes, when I was researching the book on Melbourne, I looked at a lot of autobiographies of some people who became famous when they were adults and some people who didn't, some people who could afford to write an autobiography in terms of time and finances and so on. And it was lovely not to have to read the whole book, because often what they did in adulthood was very dull. I wanted to know about what they were doing when they were children and young people. And sometimes this all got compressed into a single chapter at the start of the autobiography, and other times it was half of the autobiography. It's really interesting to see how different writers approached this. But yes, in some ways I didn't want to know about what they did as an adult, because I felt it might colour my view of their experience as a child. So I think we might be kindred spirits in our approach.
Great. Some other good questions in the chat. A couple of people are very interested. Sandra Williams, but also Kay Wadilov is interested in if you've got any thoughts. It's quite a big question, this. Any comments on children's literature and the construction of childhood?
Yes, lots of thoughts. I'm really open for using literature produced by children and about children as an historical source. Apologies that I try and recoup these types of sources into the historical discipline within which I'm located, rather than necessarily going to that discipline and taking my historical sources over there, because I'm more of an expert on history than children's literature per se. So, the book on the British World had 2 chapters on children's literature within it. I'd encourage everyone to read Michelle J. Smith's work, for example, which is terrific. Hilary Emmett as well was in that book. So constructions of childhood are very significantly sort of fabricated and made in other ways through literary depictions, and one could study those alone and have a lifetime of research ahead of us. What's particularly interesting is where you can show that those literary depictions were in the hands of young people at the time that they were being produced. So were these constructions produced about children for adult readers, or did they end up that way? Or were they in the hands of young people and then potentially helped frame their own self-understanding of themselves as young people? That's particularly interesting. So other than to say I'm all for it, I'm not quite sure what more to say on that question, other than, yes, I think it's very significant.
Great. There's another really good question here from Pablo Toro Blanco, who thanks you first of all for an excellent talk. But maybe you could say a bit more about the challenges of understanding non-Western childhood and youth.
Yeah, well, one of the challenges, there are many. This is something that, again, sorry to keep plugging this book, that Christine and I have been writing about in our edited book. One of the challenges is structural. So, for instance, in the time of COVID, lots of people have been resorting to online sources. These are often these are often the gift, as it were, except you have to pay for them, of large publishing conglomerates, and that means that they're in English most of the time. So, so there's a problem in terms of access to non-English language source material. There are paywalls and so on. And that, you know, not everyone can immediately get hold of, say, the Journal of the History of Childhood and Youth at their institution. So that there's all sorts of things to do with that. That's coupled with the ability of scholars from the non-West to, before the time of COVID, to travel to conferences, which was obviously very expensive. Hopefully that's going to change more. I think all conferences will now have an online element. I'd be very surprised if they didn't. I'm sure many more people have turned up to this today because it's online than would have trooped across London to find us, and there are people from around the world here today as well, which is great. But I think the other challenges are linguistic. We're still not very good, at least in Britain, at learning other languages. I don't know how your Russian is or how your Japanese is, but mine is not very good, in fact, non-existent. So we probably need all to learn, you know, new languages. There are some very impressive scholars of childhood that have multiple languages. So Aaron Moore at Edinburgh, for example, writes, you know, comparing Chinese, Japanese, and other national experiences of childhood, and I look with envy at his source space and so on. So I think linguistically there are challenges. There are probably challenges also in terms of research chairs and where they are, and research centres and where they are. So the challenges are as much, I think, institutional and structural, because I think the source material probably is there. It's just awaiting its scholars who can't always access it or have the support to access it. Although that is changing a lot, you know, in the last sort of 20 years, the number of studies of childhoods in African countries has expanded a lot. So I think, you know, we're heading in a productive direction, but we must acknowledge the privileges that those of us working in places such as Queen Mary and King's enjoy that we don't always remember. Thank you.
I might move on to a comment now from Rosemary Miller, which just reflecting on some of the things you said and links to some of her work. So she writes that the lost child is an important literary trope in Australian culture, which I'm sure you're familiar with, and relates to historical occurrences such as the missing Beaumont children who disappeared from an Adelaide beach. This is also a colonial trope where the child was configured as innocent and representing a young nation. And in Rosemary's PhD, she's focused on the Australian Gothic through the novels of Sonia Hartnett, who was a Melbourne novelist. And she's interested in your accounts of children who resourcefully travel across the city, so sort of using their own mapping, spatial skills and so on.
Yeah, there were lost urban children as well as lost children in what's referred to as the Australian bush. There are a couple of studies of bush lost children, as they're referred to, which I'm sure the contributor will know. There's Kim Tawney's Babes in the Bush, and there's Peter Pearce's Country of Lost Children. And both of those do different work in seeking to understand this very common phenomenon where children working at the fringes of white settlement, white colonial settlement, went off to play or gathered wood and so on, and got lost amidst the eucalyptus forests and scrubland, sometimes came to a very untimely end, sometimes were rescued, sometimes returned years later. But as for traveling through the city, yes, sometimes children and young people were doing that and were intercepted because it was thought that they were lost. So I have an example. I can't remember her name off the top of my head, of a girl who ends up in a reformatory school in Australia, who is intercepted riding the trams of Melbourne in the late 19th century, and rather wonderfully, her voice is captured in the institutional report, and one feels such pathos and empathy for her, because she says that all she wanted to do was travel the world, and she thought that she could do this by riding the trams of Melbourne, and in a way that was her world. No ability, of course, for her to get outside Australia at that tender age. So lost urban children were very much on the minds of adult reformers, although the children themselves often did not regard themselves as lost. And certain reformers, such as the secretary of the Melbourne City Newsboys Society, Edith Irons, said that her youthful charges, her youthful newsboys, were as much at home in the city as old men. They knew all the hiding places and sort of secret areas around the river, and they had an intimate topography, or rather topographical knowledge of the city. So lost is kind of a term that we might think is in the eye of the beholder, as much as in the kind of understanding of the person we're considering.
Great, thank you. And actually, Hetty's just posted in the chat a reference to Peter Pearce's book, The Country of Lost Children. Yeah, an Australian Anxiety. Good. Well, I think we're kind of approaching the end of our slot. This has been wonderful. Of course, there are many advantages to doing this using Zoom in this medium, and it's wonderful to have an international audience. So thank you for everybody for coming. Of course, normally now we'd probably disappear off and have a glass of something, which would always be very nice thing to do. Particularly here in London, it's sunny and it's sort of, well, reasonably warm anyway. That would have been a nice thing, but I'm sure there'll be another opportunity to do that at some point. I'm going to hand back to Kira in a second, but I just personally wanted to thank Simon for such a wonderfully interesting, enriching and stimulating discussion. So thank you so much, Simon, for sharing so much and for answering all those questions at the end.
Oh, thank you for having me. Thank you so much. I've really enjoyed it. I'll look back over the comments and questions now, and hope to see everyone at the next talk as well.
Great. Kira.
Thank you, Alastair, and thank you, Simon. And in fact, thank you also to all of the members of the audience who are similarly saying, you know, really positive things about the impetus that an event like this event has given to their own research and thoughts. So really, genuinely, enormous thanks to you both for such a wide-ranging and really kind of lively discussion, incredibly thought-provoking and inspiring, and also for managing to kind of respond so in such a kind of generous way to so many different, very wide-ranging questions from the audience. So that was absolutely fantastic, and it was so rich and managed to touch on so many different disciplinary areas. So thank you all also to the, and I think, yeah, it will be very gratifying later, I think, Simon and Alastair, for you to be reading the comments. But I would very much like to thank the audience for being here and for your really wonderful questions and remarks. And I hope to see you at our next two events. And there was some nice connections. There was quite a lot of reference actually being made to Mara Gubar's work, and she's going to be our next speaker on the 6th of May. with myself and Rachel Bryant-Davis. And then the third event, as you can see, well, actually it's quite small, but it's on the 24th of May. And that's going to be with Hedy Viterbo, who has been posting in the chat, and with the Rachels. It's Rachel Rosen, Professor Rachel Rosen, and Rachel Humphreys from Queen Mary. So thank you all again enormously. And yes, sorry about the lack of beverages, but we'll have to think of a way to remedy that in future. Thank you.